Are you a physician who wants more autonomy in how you practice or fulfillment in your life? If so, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Change Physician podcast, where you can learn the mindset, skills, and strategies to create the life you want without selling out your morals or values. I'm your co-host, Dr. Melissa Cady, joined by my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro. And today we're going to be talking about a special story of Dr. Eric Tait, who is a physician, investor, speaker, and author of The One Thing That Changed Everything. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Tait.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Kevin, for having me on.
Absolutely. Well, we always like to start off with a little bit of background so we can get a better sense of who you are. And for us, obviously, as physicians, is starting back in pre-med, a little bit from pre-med to medical school to residency. Do you mind starting that story?
Yeah, not a problem. Yeah, not a problem. I attended Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. I had an uncle who was an oral surgeon who had gone there as well. Went there primarily because at the time it was a school that put the most African-American males into medical school. It was an easy kind of elevator path. You just plug into the system, and we were shunted right up and into medical school. So it was a path of least resistance for me from a medical school standpoint. Quite a few guys from my undergraduate went to where I went to medical school at Baylor College of Medicine. I also knew at the time that Baylor was going to be setting up a MD MBA program. I guess when I was a sophomore, they were just setting it up. So I knew if I went there, I wouldn't have to take the GMAT. And I knew I wanted to do a dual degree program. I had done some summer programs at UPenn and really got enamored of kind of melding kind of business and medicine from that standpoint. So went down to Baylor College of Medicine, did a dual degree program at Rice University as well. Baylor's interesting because they do basic sciences in a year and a half. So the dual degree program ended up being only 5 years in total. So I got the MD and the MBA, 5 years total. And got out from that standpoint. And then went to internal medicine residency. Went down to UTMB in Galveston, so about 45 minutes south of Houston on the Gulf of Mexico. So, Barrier Island, kind of island living a little bit there, and then came back to Houston, joined a mentor of mine in private practice for the first 4 years of practice, then joined another private practice for 4 years, then joined a hospital-based practice because basically at that point, everybody was selling to the hospital. Interestingly enough, I was also an owner in that hospital, so I kind of semi-employed myself, interestingly enough. And then maybe about 3 years ago, I got to the point where I was able to essentially go down to 1 day clinically because of what we had done in the investment world. And then I just opened my own practice, kind of a boutique practice at that point. So I'm in private practice, but don't take insurance. It's pretty much cash pay, and I partner with one of the Medicare Advantage plans where I am also an owner in a full risk contract. And so I have a fairly boutique practice with mostly Medicare patients.
Wow.
So just from that path, that sounds like you pretty much knew what you were getting into when you started. Meaning it seemed very, there was a plan there. from the beginning. When did that plan start?
So I knew probably when I was 5 or 6 years old, I was going to be a physician, but I had always had an interest in business. So if you knew me growing up, I was always kind of hustling around, had side jobs, had side businesses, mostly service-based, right? So I was selling my time for dollars. Once I got to medical school, I realized that selling time for dollars was probably not going to be the best path forward necessarily. And so I figured that out relatively early. I actually figured it out before I actually went to business school at that point in time. And so I'll always give full credit to Robert Kiyosaki and Rich Dad Poor Dad for opening my eyes to that because that book was written in 97. I went to medical school in 98. And so my college roommate called me and said, "Hey guy, you got to read this book." And I did. And as he was writing, I was going through training. And so it completely set the mindset for me in terms of understanding the difference between labor and capital, and which controls which. And so that pretty much let me always understand where I was in the hierarchy and where I wanted to be essentially in the revenue cycle. And what I mean by that is this: you want to be as high as possible in the revenue chain and not be the back end of the revenue chain, which is essentially you're just a provider. You are the one who's last in line. And that's what most physicians are when it comes to the revenue that comes into healthcare. And so once you figure that out, you try to figure out how do you move your labor further up the value chain in the hierarchy of medicine, if you can. And if you can't, then you have to understand that and realize that the time where you're selling your time for money is one thing, but you have to have real ownership and equity in something else if you ever really want to be free. And it isn't stocks and bonds that are going to do that for most people.
Right. So I hope I didn't interrupt you, Kevin, but I'm curious, as far as your most, I did read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, by the way, and it's funny, you can read things and not necessarily implement them in totality. You could understand it and maybe not implement it. But of the things of being in the top of the food chain or letting your money work for you instead of you working for the money, what would you say are your most prized types of things that you think are, the best avenues, in your opinion, that have worked for you for physicians to maybe consider?
And so I always have a thing. I was talking to a couple of potential investors today, actually, and I tell people all the time, I can't tell people what to do. I can just tell people what I do, right? And so for me, real estate was the easiest and most basic way. As they say, medicine is a jealous mistress, maybe a little bit patriarchal, but it is what it is, right? And so I knew I was not going to be creating an operating business while I was practicing medicine. I didn't go to business school to become, to work in kind of medical administration. I knew I always wanted to practice medicine. And so I had to look around to figure out ways that my money could work for me, but generate income to me, because I wanted to always be able to replace my income so I can choose when and how I wanted to work, right? Ultimately, I come from a decently long line of physicians, many of whom were turn of the century, so there weren't specialties there. They were country docs, right? They had herbs in their garden. People paid them in chickens and things of that nature. And so that holistic care, independent of what the payment model is something that I cared about. And so if I could make my income independent of medicine, then how I practice medicine was going to be independent of the payment model. And so for me, it was always a binary decision. Either I put my money in things that paid me or I didn't. If it didn't pay me, I didn't buy it. It's a simple decision, but people make it very complicated. And when they make it complicated and they talk about all these different ways on why you shouldn't do that, and X, Y, and Z, I don't fight people. I don't tell them that's the case, right? Fine, if that's your belief system, good, roll with it. Tell me how that's working for you, right? And so for me, as I say, I can only tell you what I did. And so it started with real estate, then it started with me investing in hospices, investing in the hospital I'm part of, investing in the insurance company I'm a part of. Again, I'm going to be doing this work anyway. I'm going to be sending patients to hospice. I'm going to be sending patients to the hospital. I'm going to be taking this insurance company. Why don't I move up the value chain? Why don't I sit at the table where the money's coming in so I can get a piece of that at an earlier stage than when all I'm getting paid for is expending the labor. And so that's just the pathway that I took. And it's morphed a little bit as time has gone, but for the most part, it's still a binary decision for the bulk of my personal investments. And then all I did was open up my personal investments to other investors, and then we just move forward. And so it's very binary decisions for us in many cases around what it is we're going to own and how it is we're going to expend the capital that we've already worked for.
How did you get into that group of people that think, at least the right people to know, like to get involved with those types of projects? How did you get yourself into that?
So I'm a big personal development guy. And so I'll probably spend 10% of my income a year on personal development. I'm a seminar person. I'm kind of have an eternal curiosity. And so I pay people. I pay for mentorship. I pay if someone is doing something that I want to do, it means that I can do it as well. And so I just need to learn what it is that they're doing and learn it from somebody who's already done it, right? People always make the mistake of trying to learn from people's mistakes. I don't care about how you can't do something. What I care about is finding the people who've actually done it correctly, because they're the shortcut. Thomas Edison took 10,000 ways not to do the light bulb. Cool. Tell me the one way you did it, because I don't care about the other 10,000, right? And so I'm about kind of efficiency of process and only talking to people who've done what it is you want to do and ignoring all the naysayers who tell you why they can't be done. Because chances are either they didn't do it, or they're doing what Tony Robbins says is taking someone else's referral past experience and generalizing it to the rest of the world. I don't do that. I look exactly for the people who've done it. And when someone says, oh, that's too good to be true, I say, maybe, but let's do a little research and find out if that's the case or not.
Wow.
That's an excellent kind of point to kind of clarify here, because it'd be interesting to me is I think that personal development space, like people are saying, what do you mean pay for mentorship or whatever? And from a personal standpoint, I think we need more of that in the medical system. If physicians realized that there were people that you can model, that there was information out there that you can take and apply in groups that you can go to. Yeah, the difference between a personal development, and you can use Tony Robbins or somebody else as an example, but a space where people are actively trying to take control of their life, that kind of conference or event is so night and day difference than the typical medical conference that we all go to, that I would encourage just physicians in general just to go to, pick something that looks interesting, that seems to have, if you have an outside interest or business idea, go to that kind of conference and just compare it to the medical ones that we go to. Just, I don't know. You're kind of nodding your head there, and I just had to break in because it is so exciting to me to hear people talk about that, because it is such a night and day difference from the standard medical conference that we go to.
Yeah, I always like to say that physicians are, in many ways, and I had the benefit of going to business school and getting a very different perspective. Physicians go through what I would argue is an arrested development, right? And so we end up staying in a process where we are perpetual students for an extended period of time. And so while our cohort and colleagues not in medicine are out living life, getting experiences, doing these kinds of things, we're sheltered away amongst each other, right? And the problem is, once we start the process, it's 10 years before we finished. And there is no industry that looks the same 10 years prior than it does 10 years later. And so we come out, we're stunted in many ways. We're stunted emotionally. We're stunted financially. We've literally been in an ivory tower setting for most of this time with people who have no real life experience, no real life touch, and have a value system that has really nothing to do with the real world, right? You have a ton of researchers who are just doing stuff, in many ways, navel gazing themselves in research, but have no applicability to what's going on in the ground in the real world. And so you're unleashing us 10 years later behind our cohorts financially, and in many other ways, and people feel like they're trying to catch up, and it can oftentimes create an angst that, I would argue is unwarranted. And so because the personal development space has not infiltrated medicine, because the value system in medicine is different than, like, in the real world, people do personal development because they want to move to the next level of whatever that is. Well, when we graduate, we're attendings. We're at the highest level. There's no more. That's it. This is what your life looks like for the next 30 years, right? And so there's no next thing, which is the other thing that creates angst for physicians as well. Is like, well, Willie, what's next? And so in our world, what we try to do is decouple the ego from the profession. We've gotten so wrapped up into being physicians and what that means. But the problem is, as physicians, we don't have autonomy. And so without any autonomy, nothing happens without us, but we can control nothing. That is complete cognitive dissonance. And it makes perfect sense as to why people feel burned out. And what I try to explain to people is just a reframing and a reshifting, right? Listen, this is a job. It is a calling as well. But in the end, please give up the notion, unless you are going to do your own practice that is cash pay, give up the notion that physicians will ever again control the purse strings of medicine. We had the chance, we blew it, we pillaged the system. They will never give that back to us. So we will never control the payment model. The problem is the payment model determines the delivery model. And so the delivery model will never be determined by us again unless you go out on your own as a cash pay person. And so once people can give up that pipe dream of thinking that we're going to control the workplace of medicine and just let that go, right? Let it go. Stop trying to fight it. Doesn't mean you don't make things better. It doesn't mean you don't care about patient safety. But in the end, understand that we are labor. If you get off the high horse of we're special and just say, you know what, we are labor, we are here as labor. Once you reframe your understanding and expectations of that and build your hobbies, build your income, build your relationships, build everything else outside of medicine that fulfills you, and find other things besides the profession to fulfill you, you'll have a lot of this burnout stuff go away. And so some of this is just a reframing process, right? I tell my patients all the time, stress is when your reality of life does not meet the expectations of your life. And if you can't control the reality, then you need to shift your expectations. And most physicians have to shift expectations. doesn't mean that you are downgrading expectations. It means you're shifting what it is you can control to the things you actually can control.
I just love your conviction about everything you just said there. I just have to say that is fantastic. I know, Kevin, you're probably trying to chime in too.
Well, no, because that's another really important point. And I talk about this a lot too with what I call the circle of control, right? And you have this circle, and everything interior of that circle is stuff that you can control. And everything external to it, you don't. And the problem, and actually, if you even look at the data and research when it comes to occupational stress and burnout, if you externalize that level of control and you are trying to control things that you do not have objective measures to control, you're going to kill yourself. And in medicine, you know, whether it's self-inflicted or not, we have these systems that put all these outside metrics that we're now being responsible for things that we don't have control over, but we think that we do. And it's you know, I just absolutely love it. I applaud that. Again, it seems from very early on you were I'm just contrasting to my own personal medical journey when I went in, and it was like, I'm just going to go to medical school. And I learned a lot of these things through the path. But I think if people had at least had your mindset, or at least had taken a couple moments up front to kind of recognize sort of what medicine can do and what medicine isn't from the get-go, it would be a different journey for a lot of different people.
Absolutely. I mean, my wife works at the VA. You know, if there's ever a frustrating place, that would be it, right? But I explained to her the Dilbert principle, the Dilbert comments. You just have to read the Dilbert comments, right? If more physicians just read Dilbert, they'd figure this out. Just say no. They're not going to fire all of us. Right? Just say no. If things just don't make any sense, just say no. We're so duty bound and quote unquote honor bound and such rule followers. And some of that is just, we pick the wrong people for the profession these days. All we do is pick people who can test well. And it doesn't really translate well into workforce, but that's a different discussion for a different day. And so we're so used to taking orders and being yes people, as opposed to just, sometimes you just have to say, you know, no, we're not doing that, right? That's not going to happen. And see what happens from a consequence standpoint, right? In the end, as I tell people, you can always get a locums job. We are unemployed by choice. And if you're willing to understand that, you put up with a lot less. And physicians are our own worst enemies when it comes to kind of workplace and workforce treatment issues. We just don't say no to things. And I'm not saying create a union, you know, that's illegal, but we just don't say no to things that make no sense, all right? And if you don't have the conviction to say no to things that don't make any sense to you, can you really blame a system that you were essentially complicit in because you didn't say no?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I could just keep going, Melissa, but I'm going to pause a minute here.
No, I'm not going to go into my story, but in general, I've just became unemployable as of October last year, and I'm still doing some labor part-time general anesthesia while I work on other things, but it's a really good feeling to be able to kind of call the shots to a certain extent, at least be in control of my schedule as much as I want to be. But I am curious about the conflicts through this process. I mean, you have a certain, you have this sense of conviction and confidence that I assume is what's kind of driven you to this point. I'm assuming that you've had that at least to a certain extent all along, but I'm wondering through the process, were there certain hangups or conflicts or challenges that you had along the way that there's some lessons learned there, or just some moments that you realized, just something you learned from?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it was an evolutionary process, right? Like I say, business school was very helpful to me from the standpoint of understanding, juxtaposing being a professional student in two different professions, right? Mm-hmm. In business school, I literally would have, classmates yelling at teachers saying, I am here paying you, you are not teaching me. And juxtaposing that with us taking the abuse that we do on wards and clerkships, right? I'm like, wait a second. As third and fourth year midterms, I reframed it because I came back essentially at the end of third year. I was like, wait, I'm paying to be here. I'm going to create the learning pathway I need to finish this process. And so some of it was just opening your eyes and realizing that there's just a certain level of there's just a certain level of treatment you will and will not stand for, right? Right or wrong, right? And ultimately, if the ethos of the profession says that this is the norm, then that may not be the profession that you need to be in, right? That may not be the way that you need to do things, right? You can't necessarily say that you, one person, if everybody else is doing it this way, are going to be able to change that whole thing, right? You have to just get enough other people who believe what you believe to change the whole thing. So doing it by yourself is not one of those things. And so, I would say on our neurology rotation I had, the resident and I just didn't get along. I just went to the attending and said, listen, she cannot evaluate me. I did not feel comfortable. I laid it out and I said, you will have to be the one who evaluates me. I didn't really give him a choice, because had he not said, okay, I would have gone to the clerkship director at the medical school, right? And so I don't mind taking things up the chain of command to get what I want from the standpoint, especially if I'm paying for it, right? But the flip side is you have to be willing to bear the consequences of those actions. Listen, I'm a primary care physician. I can always do locums. I can always support myself. There's nothing that money is not I don't have fear around money. And that's another discussion, deeper psychological discussion that many people have, right? Mm-hmm. Most physicians could tomorrow work a quarter less, but they don't want to take a quarter paycheck. They don't want to take 3/4 of the paycheck, right? And so once you reframe your relationship around money and how much you really need and want, and how much money is worth versus your sanity, that's a whole different kind of discussion, right? Now we're saying, okay, most physicians, if I took a quarter away of your clinical duties, you would have a much happier life. And if you ask people, they're like, yeah, absolutely. I'm like, okay, well, are you willing to take 3/4 of your paycheck to do that? And most people are not willing to do that. Well, that's really that's a conscious choice to say that I'm not willing to do that the money is more important to me than the sanity in some ways, right? Yeah. Yeah. And again, we get to live with the consequences of our own actions. But until you frame it for people in such a way that they realize that and say, oh, okay, well, I get it now. Okay, I might need to go and just take a step back. And it'll be interesting to see post-COVID, right? Because people have been forced to take that step back, are much happier, and are realizing, okay, I might be taking a pay cut, but I like my life a little bit better. Like, okay, cool, perfect. Now the question is, okay, how do you replace that? And then that's how you use investments and those other kind of things to not have to take the pay cut, but still work less. And we're not talking about people leaving medicine. We're talking about just, replacing a quarter of your income so you can work a quarter less. Your life will be, instead of working 5 days a week, you work 4 days a week. Your life is infinitely better working 4 days a week than 5 days a week. Infinitely.
Absolutely. Yeah. Go ahead, Kevin.
Well, there was a couple of things there. One I really loved is when you present it as that choice is like, well, if you want to have that extra day, then you're going to lose that extra income. And if then you choose to not do that, there's a cognitive reappraisal there where you're making it an active choice. So, and that's an important difference for the listener too, is there's a difference between feeling that you're in control, that you wish you had a better life, but you don't know what to do. And then recognizing that you can actually choose to make less and have a better life, but you are choosing to not do that. That active choice has a huge role on that perceived stress. The second path, though, is, and we didn't talk about this, but I just read on your website before we started this interview, is very early on, you made that choice because some of your first positions, you said, I worked less so that I would have more of my time. And we've talked a little bit about reasons why, but would you be a little bit more specific for the listener on how you design that conscious choice to work less early on in your career, earning less, but why that was important for you?
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear. The only asset you can't buy more of is time, right? I can pretty much buy almost anything else, right? If I have the time, I can pretty much do anything else. I can be healthy. I can have all these things. And so time, we've got 80 years if we're lucky on this planet, right? Give or take, plus or minus, right? And so I figured that's the whole kind of trading time for dollars. Time is the real commodity, right? Dollars are fungible. Money's fungible. There's a million ways to make money. It's super easy to make money with your labor. It's not quite as easy without your labor, right? That's where the key is. That's where real financial intelligence comes in, right? Anybody can buy a stock or a bond. Question is, how do you get paid a real rate of return without having to work all the time, right? And so that's really the crux and the key. And that's really where I spent most of my time focusing on, because money doesn't matter to me. I can make a whole lot more. I'd be making a whole lot more money right now doing other things, but I have pretty much all the time I want. And that to me is more important than the money. And so then it's just a matter of shifting your priority to decide what's more important to you, right? And you hit the nail on the head, right? When when you understand you're making an affirmative choice to live the life that you want to live because you want to make the money that you want to make, you don't now feel trapped. See, physicians feel trapped, right? That's why the beauty of giving a physician at least $1 of passive income is so mentally freeing to them, because they realize, oh crap, I actually can make money without actually having to get up every day and go to work, right? And when you get that first dollar of passive income that you don't have to continuously go with, your whole mindset changes about everything, right? Everything you look at looks very, very different. And so that's why I'm a big, big, big proponent of it, is because it changes who you are as a person, because it breaks the paradigm of what everyone's ever taught you, is that to get more and to make more, you have to work harder and do all these kinds of things and sacrifice yourself at the altar of the grindstone. No, not necessarily. You don't have to do that. And, there are other ways of doing that.
Yeah. Well, speaking of just this transition that you had, or maybe some of the things you knew were really a key component to what is become your life now, is there a particular key ingredient that, or maybe a nugget that a physician, you've already given several, but is there one particular thing that really made the difference for you in creating the life you have now?
Yeah, understanding that passive income frees you. It's no more difficult than that. It gives you choices. It allows you to have the choices to make about your time without sacrificing your material lifestyle. You don't feel want, right? The big thing that I have around the FIRE movement is most of those people are going to feel want. They're going to feel deprivation. I don't want to feel deprivation. I am an and both guy. I'm not an either or guy. And so my question is, how do you do all the things that you want? You can't do it all at the same time, but you can build a life that will get you all that you want without deprivation. And that feeling of deprivation, we've already our minds have already been sitting and steeping in that through our whole training, right? And so now you're going to end up wanting more. Okay, now I'm out. Now I'm attending. Oh crap, but I'm not going to get the full complement of my pay because I want a better lifestyle. So it's that more grinding of deprivation, of feeling like you're sacrificing. And I'm like, no, you can do what it is you want to do. It may take a little bit of time, but you don't have to be deprived if you make different kinds of choices on the money you're already working for.
Right. An abundance mindset is
Correct.
Clearly what you have.
Absolutely. 1 + 1 = infinity.
That's right.
And just to be real clear for people who may not be familiar with the term FIRE, is the financially independent retire early, is what you're referring to when you said FIRE.
Yes,
FIRE
yes,
movement.
absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that's, because like you said, unless you change the mindset about all this stuff, if you're killing yourself, oh, I need to work as hard as I can and not spend any money and deprive myself for 6 years so then I can stop medicine, you've lost 6 years of your life right there. And you haven't changed your mindset.
Nope.
And you haven't really created anything for the future by doing that. So,
well, you probably have net worth, but if we hit a depression, we hit something that does that. Well, if I cut your net worth in half, are you still independent, financially independent, right? That's the issue with what I like to call a magical nest egg number, is you better pray that the market stays high, because if it doesn't, then what are you going to do?
Yeah. Just curious, I know we're getting to the end of this interview, but I'm curious with, now that I'm on my own, I do a self-directed retirement that I already had, instead of letting somebody else put it in places, and getting involved in real estate. And pretty much that's where I like to invest most of the extra income. And I'm curious if you kind of have like multifamily. There's a couple of things that I'm involved in. Are there certain types of niches of real estate that you like the most?
So just to give you a sense, we own dozens of single family homes. We've owned multifamily. We've sold most of them because prices are just too high. Probably own about 750,000 square feet of retail and self-storage. We're building some student housing. We own the part owners in the Hilton in Belize. We own coffee plantations in Panama. We love real estate. We are asset class agnostic. We go where there's a market need, and we can partner with a team that can fulfill the need of that marketplace, right? And so it just depends on what your specific goals are, and what's in front of you, right? I mean, I love multifamily, but we haven't been in it in three and a half to 4 years because the pricing just doesn't make sense. We can get better returns on the retail side right now, with less exposure to taxes and all these other kinds of things, right? And even coming through COVID, knock on wood, we've actually weathered it pretty well. And so that kind of buoys our stance. Now, are we looking for a good B-class multifamily? Absolutely, if we can find one. But the pricing is just kind of crazy right now. And so we're not willing to take a 3 or 4% cash on cash return when I can just buy an AT&T stock and get that as a dividend, right? So it's a risk reward situation around real estate. And we also like to zig when everybody's zagging, right? Everybody and their mother wants to be in multifamily. And so that means that there are other spaces where people are not, where you can get arbitrage opportunities and get things that are undervalued that can still generate the cash flow that we want and still have a kind of long-term play. We're bullish on farmland and things of that nature. And so we're looking where other people are not looking right now.
Yeah. Well, you've got some, it's very clear that you're very financially savvy, because some of the terms like arbitrage and other things I'm familiar with, but I know that my colleagues would not know what we're talking about. But essentially marking it up and selling it, but there's other words for it. But I'm curious, one last random question. I know you've mentioned a couple of guys already, but as far as personal development, are there other people that you've enjoyed following? I mean, Brendan Burchard's one of the ones. There's several other people out there that do a lot of personal development. Any other ones you like?
Yeah, I mean, you can do you can do the pantheon, right? Dennis Waitley, you can do Zig Ziglar, you can do Jim Rohn. I mean, you can do all the big guys. We just talked about abundance, so Dr. Stephen Covey, and there's some lesser known people, right? So I train with a lot of people, right? So there's Delatoro McNeil, right? He's probably the best speaker trainer out there, right? Friend of mine, colleague. I send as many people as I can to him for people who want to become mass communication masters, right? They're just people out there that, you know, people that I do it almost around skill set. And so when I'm looking to learn a new skill, I will try to find somebody who has a personal development background, but then is teaching a specific skill, because they're going to interweave all of these principles into kind of the skill acquisition side of the table from that standpoint. And so I tend to do it around skill acquisition and then backfill in terms of looking, because once you're in personal development, you can hear certain phrases and terms and realize, okay, oh, I know who you studied with. We're good to go, right? And then Tony Robbins, of course. And so it's one of those things that Darren Hardy, I'm trying to think who else. Oh, I'm forgetting the gentleman, white hair. He's probably the patriarch right now in the space. Tom Hopkins for sales. I love Tom Hopkins from a sales training standpoint. He's still doing a few live events, even though he's getting up in age. And the last guy, Brian Tracy. Thank you. Good. Jesus.
Oh yes, Brian.
And then
Tracy.
Brian Tracy, right? So that's kind of the pantheon of folks that I follow, I would say.
That's great. I just think it's good for people to listen if they've never gone down this road. You know, you're going to find certain ones you resonate more with, but it's good to start somewhere.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, as we tie up here, if you had to pick one book that you would recommend to the listeners to read to kind of start their journey, or at least is you found very valuable to you, what would that book be?
Ooh. Can I do it by category? Because it's going to be, so if I had, the one book I always give everybody is Rich Dad, Poor Dad, right? That's the one book that is the foundation. But ultimately, most people, you know, it's a New York Times bestseller, but if you talk to the number of people who've actually implemented any of the principles, it's a vanishingly few. And so then really we would probably have to flip to Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. As I explain to people, it ain't about getting rich. And I tell people read it 7 times and then read it once a year after that, right? Because nothing changes until your mindset changes. And so I can give you all of the how-tos and the this, that, and the other, but until you have decluttered your mind from all of the conditioning that your families and your religion and your gender and your race have given you, until you get rid of all that stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and rebuild it up with what you actually believe for yourself from your own heart, you're not going to ultimately change. And so the Think and Grow Rich, I think, is probably the most foundational one, because if you get what it actually is saying,
Mm-hmm.
you can get rid of all the negative and limiting beliefs. But it takes a while, right? It takes a few reads to really get down to the crux of it from that standpoint. So it's between those two books, right?
Perfect. And
Awesome.
I would say to the listener out there, what Dr. Tait just told you is really, really crucial. It's you, because your perception affects your reality. And so if you are not monitoring how you perceive the world, your reality may not be something that that you enjoy too much. And we can have a lot more active control over that. So I appreciate that. Those are two great books. Melissa, anything else that you want to add there?
No, I probably have questions for another hour, but we'll just leave it there for now.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Eric, thanks for coming on today. You were a fantastic guest. I think just like Melissa said, I think we could have multiple conversations, because I was just sitting here jotting notes going, man, we could have talked about this, we could talk about that. But I think this is a great place to end off here. Where could the listener, if they're physicians and they're looking to learn more about you, learn more about what you're doing or the paths that you've taken, where can they find you?
Yeah, there's probably two easy ways to do that. So on the investment side, well, one, you can just probably Google me, ERICTAIT. I Google decently well, so you can probably find me that way. But on the investment side, our investment page is vernonville.com, which is V as in Victor, E as in Eric, R as in Robert, N as in Nancy, O as in Octagon, N as in Nancy, V as in Victor, I as in Indigo, L as in Larry, L as in Larry, E as in Eric.com, so vernonville.com. Any sign up for the newsletter, send a contact us, all that will come through me or to my staff, or just do eric@vernonville.com. And then on the physician side, because I have a special place in my heart for what you guys are doing, same way, thephysiciansroad.com. That's our physician services platform. And so we have kind of 5 pathways to help people create, as we say, create your life in medicine on your own terms. And so it's 5 pathways from kind of wealth creation, personal development, relationships, health, and kind of practice enhancement, where we have podcasts and other resources that you can use to try to create the life that makes sense for you. And you know, you can email me through that site as well if you need anything. But there are a lot of resources you may not even need me. We just put up there for free that you can have.
Fantastic.
Awesome. It's fabulous.
Well, everybody, thank you very much for joining us today on the Change Physician podcast, where you're going to learn the mindset, skills, and strategies to create a meaningful life and practice. Thank you very much to our guest today, Dr. Eric Tait. Wonderful to have you. Hope to have you on in the future. And for everybody else out there, stay well.
Take care.
Thank you so much.